there's another commentary here on the fear of death and the world to come, and what the world to come means and what it is, that's hiding in a Gemara that it now seems clear to me is commenting directly on this passage in the Chumash. And so I can't resist the temptation to share this observation. So we're looking at Masechet Psachim, Daf Kuf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph. So Psachim 113a, and it says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Shlosha Menuhalei Ha'olam Haba, Elohim, Hadar Be'eretz Yisrael, והמגדל בניו לתלמוד תורה, והמבדיל על היין במוצאי שבתות. מהי? דים שייר מקידושה להבדלתה. So Rabbi Yochanan said, 3 people are among those who inherit Olam Haba, the world to come. One who lives in Eretz Yisrael, one who raises his sons to engage in the study of Torah, and one who recites Havdalah at the end of Shabbat over wine. And the Gemara goes on to ask, what is the special importance of reciting Havdalah over wine? And the Gemara answers, this is referring to an individual with only a small amount of wine who nevertheless leaves some of his Kiddush for Havdalah. So he had wine for Kiddush, and then he saved it for Havdalah. This is one of my favorite passages in the Gemara, and there's another shiur we did in a series about bread and wine and the end of days, which gave a completely different riff on the meaning of this that I still think is there in the text. But here, what we suddenly can realize is this Gemara is talking directly about the passage in Sefer Dvarim that we just read. Why? Because the 3 kinds of people who were being allowed to not go to war were what? Someone who had just gotten engaged and was basically just starting a family, someone who just built a house and hadn't yet lived in it, and someone who had just planted not a cherry orchard, but a vineyard, right, a kerem. So the kerem is Havdalah with wine. The woman that has just been betrothed to the man, that it's a marriage, it's going to be a family. This is about having children whom you're going to teach Torah. And the house that you built is in Eretz Yisrael, and you're going to dwell in Eretz Yisrael. And that's exactly the 3rd item that we're looking at in this Gemara from Rabbi Yochanan. So it's exactly correspondent, albeit not in the same order, which is interesting. And I don't have anything to say about that alteration of order at the moment, and whether it may only be necessary because of the additional comment on wine for Havdalah. So now we have to ask what that means, that these 2 sources have to do with each other. And I think that the basic point here is that, look, you have to at least notice that we're talking about Olam Haba here, right? We're talking about the world to come. And the other passage in Sefer Dvarim was about fear of death. It was about being afraid you're going to go to war and not come back. So these are directly related overall in their theme, in the sense that it is about this question of, if I go to war and I don't come back, then what comes afterwards, right? And who merits to have a share in what comes afterwards? And what is this thing that comes afterwards? What is Olam Haba? So on the one hand, I think there's a way of reading this, saying what Olam Haba is, that's very much about this world, right? And that's what I've argued before. This idea of saving wine from Kiddush for Havdalah, first of all, there's a matter in halacha. You're allowed to make Havdalah on things that are not wine. It's called Chamra Medina. You can make it on, a cup of tea or a glass of beer. Something that would be, a beverage worthy of honor, where you would, sit and host a guest and offer them something. So you can't make it with a glass of water, but, would you like some coffee? That kind of thing. That means you can make Havdalah on coffee. So you could have made Havdalah on coffee, but you definitely made it on wine that you saved from Kiddush. So we cleared up that connection. Now, these three different cases of inheriting Olam Haba, you live in Eretz Yisrael, you teach the Torah to your children, and you save wine from Shabbat so that you can bring the Kiddush over into the Havdalah. I think the reason that those things fit together on their own is because it's talking about how there are many experiences of Olam Haba to be achieved in this life and in this world, right? Because I can say for myself, Baruch Hashem, I didn't used to live in Eretz Yisrael, and I can fully attest that living in Eretz Yisrael as a Jew who seeks to live his life in connection with Hashem and the Torah is like living in Olam Haba. It's as though the world has gained a million colors and a million dimensions that it lacked before, because this is the time and the place to be a Jew who wants to keep the Torah, and you really feel that when you come here. It's like a new life, and so in one sense, one who lives in Eretz Yisrael, I can absolutely attest. It's like Olam Haba. It's like you've already made it there, and then you can maybe do it again. But we, Baruch Hashem, we lived a long time, a significant portion of our lives outside of Eretz Yisrael, and we made it here, and it's like the beginning of a new life. One who raises his children to study Torah, that's clearly about generational continuity, right? In one sense, Olam Haba is like the next generation, right? That you're passing on something, you're part of something that extends forever into the future, because you're teaching Torah to your children. You learned Torah from the Jewish people that came before you, and you've made yourself a part of an infinite continuum that evolves and continues to inch its way towards full understanding of Hashem, and only that whole process has a kind of eternity that matches the eternity of HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself. And the life of an individual is always ephemeral, but if you're teaching Torah to your children, then you're part of this chain that gives you a connection to a kind of immortality or existence in the next life that comes, which is the life of the next generation. And then lastly, this idea of Havdalah over wine, it's really just kind of affirming those other 2 points, because if you're chaining together Shabbatot, right, you're saying like, I'll save my Kiddush for Havdalah, the 7-day cycle of Maaseh Bereshit, it's viewing the world as being created in 7 days and then being recreated. It's like a new world. The next 7 days is a whole new world, right? So each week, in some sense, is an Olam Haba. And what matters is that you're making a connection between them, because you're carrying some wine from the Kiddush at the end of 1 week into the Havdalah at the beginning of the next week. And that means that you've kind of survived, so to speak. You've been carried over from one world to the next. And each week is a new adventure, so to speak. But I think when you make all of those points, and they're there in the text, and they're part of our tradition as well, we're very focused at the end of the day on this world. And it's very healthy, I think, to read any reference to Olam Haba from Chazal, partly by asking, what are they talking about in this world? What are they talking about in terms of a different place I could be living, a different life I could be living, a different generation that will come after me, all of those things. But I also think that now we have to read it in light of what we see in this passage in Sefer Devarim, which is clearly referred to, because now it's suddenly talking about someone really asking about Olam Haba as though it's what happens after you die, right? Because it's about fear of death. It's about saying, I'm going to go away to war, and I might not come back. And what's my relationship to what I've done in this world? And am I okay with that? And the Torah is saying you kind of shouldn't be okay with it if you built a house but you haven't lived in it. Or you kind of shouldn't be okay with it if you've, planted a vineyard but haven't made wine from it yet. Or if you've become engaged to be married but you haven't begun to build that family, after taking your wife into the new home that you'll have together. And viewing it in comparison to this comment about Olam Haba, which is focusing us on this idea of what kind of peace can one have going to war if one doesn't meet those criteria, or one isn't excluded by those criteria. I think that may be why ultimately wine becomes the central theme of all of this. Like that there's this extra comment about the wine at the end. It's not just three things that match up with three things in Sefer Dvarim. It dwells on the subject of the wine, and it talks about a little bit of the wine from Kiddush that's being saved for Havdalah. It's telling you something, perhaps, about what it could look like for there to be a life after you die, right? Because it's both using the theme of wine to say, remember about wine that it's this mercurial thing where you juice the grapes and it's just sweet, and then you have to kind of leave it enclosed in darkness for a while, and it has to wait and it has to mature, and then it becomes this completely different substance that has the ability to alter your reality with great tendency to rejoicing, but also to kind of an alteration of perspective, to see the world differently, to understand how it works, as though there's kind of an altered reality. But also there's this notion of chaining things from one vintage to the next, right? There's the idea of a small amount of wine from Kiddush that carries over into Havdalah. In the 7-day cycle of creation, Havdalah represents the moment of creation, right? We say Borei Meoreh Ha'esh, we're lighting the light, and it's like Yehi Or. It's Hashem lighting up the universe as it begins anew. And the question is, when the world begins anew, is there anything in it that has to do with the world that came before it, right? And the suggestion here is, perhaps there can be. Perhaps the remnant of what was in that previous week, in that previous world of creation, that previous 7-day cycle, where it's 7 in the language of the divine perspective on the cyclicality of creation as a whole, when there's some remnant, a bit of wine from the Kiddush that carries over into Havdalah, what it's saying is there's going to be a new world and a new life. And part of what was in the previous world will be the seed, will be the sort of kiss that starts the new light going, right? So you say Borei Pri HaGefen, and you say Borei Meoreh Ha'esh, right? So there's some notion of a connection to the previous life that kicks you off into a new world, and in between those two is Borei Minim B'Samim, right? The smelling of the spices. So there's some kind of complex, unique fragrance in some sense that carries over from one world to the next, from one life to the next. So there's a promise hiding in here, I think, that even if you're a soldier going to war who isn't excluded by any of these criteria, and you're still kind of asking the question, why shouldn't I be faint of heart if it might be the case that HaKadosh Baruch Hu would choose for me to be one of the ones who won't come back from war? And here in this Gemara may in part be the answer, don't worry, HaKadosh Baruch Hu has it in hand. There's a lot you don't understand about the world, and he understands how to make a new world that has the life, because wine is alive. It has the life of the previous vintage that carries over into the new vintage. It has the unique fragrance of that individual soul, right? The fragrance is about ruach, it's about the scent, it's about the air and the wind. Ruach Elohim merachefet al pnei hamayim, v'choshech al pnei tehom, right? This is this moment of creation, and there's this notion of a connection of unique identification that can carry something from a previous world to a next world as the first light begins. So that doesn't reveal everything to us, nor would we expect it to, about what we're supposed to understand about how Hashem can work in his incomprehensible ways that involve things like death and Tchiyat Mitim, coming back to life, or some kind of world that's different than the one that we know, or perhaps at least different than one that we conceive of. But it does seem to be here in the text once you read these two sources against each other. And that may be a good place to close for this evening.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.